They say solitude can bring clarity, but sometimes it just brings out the things that were always waiting in the dark. My name is Elias Thorne, and the story I'm about to share isn't one you'll find in any ranger's logbook. It began decades ago when I was a young man, barely out of my teens, seeking a quiet corner of the world. I found it, or so I thought, high above the dense canopy of the Whispering Peaks National Forest, working as a fire lookout. The year was 2003, a time before the constant hum of smartphones, before the world truly shrank. Back then, isolation wasn't just a concept, it was a way of life up there. The job itself was simple: keep watch. Scan the endless green expanse for any telltale wisp of smoke. Report anything out of the ordinary, maintain communication with the other scattered towers and the base. It was the kind of solitary existence I craved, a chance to clear my head, to simply be. I was running from something, I suppose, something that felt too close in the clamor of the city. Out here, amidst the ancient pines, I hoped to find a silence deep enough to drown out the echoes of my own past. Little did I know, some silences aren't empty at all. This isn't a tale of a forest fire, though. This is a story about something else, something far older and more profound than any natural disaster, something that most people dismiss as a figment of an overactive imagination, a symptom of too much time alone. But it happened, and it's been with me, a cold ember in my memory ever since. I've carried this burden for years, whispering it only to the wind, my hope of finding another who understands, or, heaven forbid, shares this terror, slowly fading. Still, I can't shake the feeling that I couldn't have been the only one. My first week in Lookout Tower 7 passed in a rhythm that quickly became a comforting lull. Each morning, the sun would paint the small windows of my cabin in hues of orange and gold, a silent alarm signaling the start of my vigil. I'd rise from my creaky cot, head to the compact kitchen, and set my old percolator bubbling. The rich aroma of coffee would fill the small space, a small anchor to normalcy in the vast wilderness. Mug in hand, I'd climb the few steps to the observation deck, the worn wood groaning softly underfoot. From this vantage point, the view was breathtakingly beautiful, yet also daunting. A boundless sea of trees stretched out in every direction, an emerald ocean that seemed to ripple endlessly towards the horizon. My job was to watch this immensity, to discern the faint gray line of smoke from the morning mist, to be the forest's watchful eye. It was a heavy responsibility. A single spark could consume this kingdom, but I embraced it. My radio equipment, a sturdy, dated console with a thick microphone, sat on a wooden table, my lifeline to the outside world. Every morning and evening, like clockwork, I'd report in, a brief exchange of vital signs with the base and the other lookouts. But on that particular afternoon, just 5 days into my assignment, the routine took an unnerving turn. I just finished my first full sweep of the western quadrant, my eyes trained through the powerful lenses of my binoculars, when I saw it. At the very edge of the tree line, far beyond any known hiking trails or logging roads, stood a cluster of figures. Shadowy, indistinct, yet undeniably there. They were still, unnaturally so, almost as if they were observing the tower or perhaps me. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a sudden, frantic drum. This wasn't in the training manual. I felt the unexpected weight of the binoculars in my hands, as if I were looking through a portal into a sharper, more unsettling reality. My grip tightened on the radio microphone, my thumb hovering over the transmit button. Hesitation gnawed at me. Was it a trick of the light, the strange way shadows played in the deep forest? But when I forced myself to look again, they remained. Their presence was a cold, irrefutable fact. Base, this is Lookout 7, do you copy? My voice, when it finally emerged, carried an unfamiliar tremor of urgency. Up until this moment, my days had been a quiet meditation. My biggest concerns were spotting a distant wisp of smoke or logging the occasional stray hiker. Now, these figures had introduced a jarring dissonance, a layer of tension I hadn't anticipated. I found myself wrestling with questions that had never entered my mind. Was I truly alone out here? What were these things? And why were they standing there, watching? The radio crackled to life, and the gruff voice of Elias, the base supervisor, responded. 7, this is base, go ahead. Elias, I'm seeing some figures at the edge of the forest standing still. Non-animal, they look. Humanoid at least. Over. There was a brief, pregnant pause. Son, you're probably just seeing some wildlife or shadows playing tricks on you. Forest gets to folks sometimes. Don't worry about it. Over. The dismissal in his voice was clear, laced with a familiar, weary patience. But the figures were still there when I looked again. Are you sure, Elias? These are different, definitely not animals. His voice held a hint of irritation this time. Listen, Thorn, it's your first week. You're not used to the woods yet. Things can look weird, especially when you're isolated. Keep your focus on spotting fires. Over. The conversation ended. I slowly lowered the microphone, the plastic cool against my fingertips. Despite his casual dismissal, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that what I was seeing was profoundly real. I meticulously logged the time and location of the sighting in my daily logbook, just in case. After the report, I tried to immerse myself back into my duties, but the focus was gone. My eyes kept darting towards the forest edge, half expecting the figures to have moved closer, or perhaps to have vanished entirely. I decided to busy myself with maintenance work, hoping physical activity would distract my racing mind. I swept the wooden floors, scrubbed the small, grimy windows until they gleamed, and even alphabetized the canned goods in my pantry. As I rearranged the tins, I also took a precise inventory of my supplies: water bottles, batteries, first aid kits. It suddenly seemed vital to know exactly what resources I had at my disposal. The afternoon wore on, stretching into the quiet hours before dusk. It was time for another sweep. I picked up my binoculars, my hands hesitating for a long moment before I raised them to my eyes. When I finally focused on the edge of the forest, the figures were gone. A wave of complicated emotions washed over me, a fleeting relief, immediately followed by a deeper unease. Had they simply retreated? Or had they moved, now lurking in a blind spot I couldn't perceive? The radio crackled to life, pulling me from my troubled thoughts. It was time for the evening check-in. I reported everything as normal, a lie that tasted bitter on my tongue. The base signed off without further questions, and I was alone again, truly alone. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery streaks, I heated some canned soup for dinner. I ate slowly, my gaze drifting to the windows more often than to my lukewarm meal. When I finished, I moved to secure the tower for the night. I locked the heavy steel door, checked the latches on every window. Normally these tasks were rote, but tonight they felt absolutely vital, a desperate ritual against an unseen threat. I tried to relax with a battered paperback, but the words on the page blurred, my mind lost in the unsettling mystery of the shadowy figures and the unknown variables they had introduced into my solitary existence. Finally, I surrendered to the inevitable and turned in for the night, knowing sleep would be a distant, elusive dream. I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for any sound out of the ordinary. Every creak of the old tower, every whisper of the wind through the tall pines, seemed amplified, transformed into a potential harbinger of something dreadful. The next day began with a grim familiarity. I woke, brewed my coffee, and ascended to the observation deck. The forest felt even more endless today, perhaps due to the knot of worry still tightening in my stomach from yesterday's strange encounter. I grabbed my binoculars and began my routine scan. The morning light filtered through the dense foliage, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground below, an optical illusion I could no longer trust. And then there they were again. This time they were closer, much closer. They stood within a small clearing, no more than 200 yards from the tower, partially obscured by the thick undergrowth, yet undeniably nearer. As I focused the binoculars, I could discern more details, or rather, more unsettling lack of detail. They appeared humanoid, yes, But they weren't covered in clothing so much as they were dark, tattered forms, ragged and torn at the edges, as if perpetually unraveling. Their features were obscured not by shadow, but by a strange, shimmering distortion, like static on an old, dying television screen. It was like my eyes couldn't quite resolve them. They refused to lock on, sliding off their forms as if trying to protect my mind from something it couldn't comprehend. A distortion about them that made them impossible to truly see, yet impossible to deny gathering my fractured thoughts. I reached for the radio microphone, my fingers cold against the plastic. I hesitated, then pressed the transmit button. "Lookout 4, this is Lookout 7. Do you copy?" I tried to keep my voice steady, to disguise the nervous energy buzzing inside me, a frantic current just beneath the surface. The radio crackled, and then a familiar voice belonging to another lookout named Silas came through. "This is Lookout 4. I read you 7. What's going on?" I paused, considering how to phrase this, how to make the impossible sound real. "Have you seen anything unusual out there lately? Specifically, shadowy figures at the edge of the forest?" The line went silent for a few seconds, longer than seemed natural. Finally, Silas responded, his voice tinged with confusion. "Shadowy figures? You mean like animals? I've seen a couple of deer, and a bear wandered through my sight lines yesterday, but no shadowy figures. Why? What are you seeing?" I exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief and deeper isolation washing over me. Relief that he hadn't immediately dismissed me, but more isolated by his utter lack of understanding. "I've seen them for 2 days now. They're not animals. They're humanoid, standing at the edge of the forest yesterday, but closer today. About 200 yards from my tower. They're just standing there, watching." Another pause on the line, even longer this time. "You sure you're not just seeing things, Thorn? It can get pretty lonely out here, you know. Minds play tricks." I gripped the microphone tightly, my knuckles white. "I'm not imagining it, Silas. I thought so too at first. But they're there today, even closer. They don't look like people, not exactly. But they're definitely not animals. They're covered in some kind of dark, tattered stuff, and their features are all blurry, like they're made of static or something." Another pause, a heavy one. This time when Silas spoke, his voice had a different tone, a subtle shift I couldn't quite place. It wasn't disbelief so much as a new, unsettling caution. "Well, I haven't seen anything like that, but I'll keep an eye out now. Just stay safe, okay? Maybe keep the door locked. Over." "Will do," I replied, setting down the microphone. His words offered little comfort. In fact, they somehow made me feel even more profoundly alone, the weight of what I was experiencing settling subtly heavier on my shoulders. The next morning, I awoke with a raw sense of apprehension. I couldn't shake the conversations and sights from the past couple of days from my mind. After brewing my coffee, a mechanical ritual, I climbed up to the observation deck, almost reluctant to pick up the binoculars. When I finally did, my hands were trembling slightly, betraying the calm I desperately tried to project. I immediately looked toward the small clearing where the figures had been yesterday, 200 yards away from the tower. My eyes scanned the area, but there was nothing there. For a fleeting moment, relief, bright and sweet, washed over me. Then, a sudden, chilling realization ripped through me. I hadn't checked the other areas, the ones closer to the tower. My hands moved almost involuntarily, steering the binoculars to scan the surrounding terrain, tracing the winding footpaths. And there they were. The shadowy figures had moved again, now just 100 yards away. They were closer, disturbing close, positioned near one of the old, barely used footpaths that meandered toward the tower. Half hidden by the trees, yet undeniably nearer. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs as I fumbled for the radio microphone. My fingers pressed the transmit button more hastily than before. "Lookout 4, this is Lookout 7, do you copy?" There was an urgency in my voice that I couldn't suppress, a raw edge of fear. "7, this is 4. What's the situation?" Silas's voice crackled through the speaker, sharper now, more concerned. He moved again, closer this time, just 100 yards away and near one of the footpaths, I said, trying and failing to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, a moment of silence heavy with unspoken dread. When Silas spoke again, his tone was serious, laced with a new kind of concern. "Are you sure it's not some hikers or hunters, Thorn? Sometimes they wander off the marked trails." "I'm sure," I replied, my voice raspy. "These aren't people, at least not any kind of people I recognize. They're closer, and it feels deliberate." "All right. Keep your eyes peeled and stay inside after dark. Lock up and keep a weapon close if you have one," Silas advised, his voice grim. "Will do," I responded, replacing the microphone on its holder. His words offered little comfort. In fact, they somehow made me feel even more profoundly alone, as if I was slowly being abandoned to an unseen menace. As I looked out over the forest, the figures seemed to blend in and out of the trees, their forms shimmering, almost liquid. The fear was eating away at me, but so was a gnawing curiosity. Just sitting up here, looking through binoculars, didn't feel like enough anymore. I needed to be proactive, to try and make sense of what I was seeing. I grabbed the topographic map of the forest area that was stashed in one of the drawers. It was an old, detailed map, showing elevation, trails, water bodies, and other landmarks. Using a red marker, I started placing X's on the map, each one representing the approximate location where I'd spotted the figures. As I stepped back to get a better view, I hoped that a pattern would emerge, something that would give me a clue as to what these figures might be. Were they following a trail? Were they near water sources? Close to an old, abandoned campsite, perhaps? My eyes darted from one red X to another, but no discernible pattern emerged. Just a haphazard, yet unnerving, progression towards my tower. Each night, the figures drew unsettlingly closer to my tower. I couldn't handle this on my own any longer. Feeling desperate for some sort of validation or advice, I grabbed my radio and tuned into Lookout 3, where another colleague, a quiet woman named Lena, worked. "Lena, this is Elias from Lookout 7. Have you ever witnessed anything strange out there? I mean, like, shadowy figures that seem to be coming closer to the tower each day." There was a pause, a few seconds of silence that felt like an eternity. Finally, Lena replied, her voice soft, hesitant. "Elias, I've never seen anything like that. It sounds creepy. Are you sure it's not just the loneliness playing tricks on your mind? Have you been getting enough sleep?" I gripped the radio tighter, frustrated but also relieved to be talking to someone, anyone. "I know what I saw, Lena. I'm not making this up. There's something out there, and whatever it is, it's getting nearer to my tower every single day. I have no idea what to make of it." Just as I heard Lena key up her radio to respond, the connection died. The radio went dead. No static, no interference, just an eerie, absolute stillness. My heart skipped a beat, then began to pound. I tapped the microphone, turned the frequency dial back and forth, gave the radio a couple of frustrated smacks, hoping to jolt it back to life. Nothing. It was utterly, terrifyingly silent. The dead radio intensified the isolation tenfold. It was like being cut off from the world by an invisible hand, left to fend for myself with an inexplicable phenomenon slowly, inexorably, encroaching upon me. Now I was truly alone. With the radio dead, I couldn't warn anyone. I couldn't ask for help. Night descended on the forest, and the darkness felt more oppressive than ever, a thick, suffocating blanket that tightened with each passing minute. Gripping my binoculars, my hands clammy, I hesitantly scanned the forest below, almost afraid of what I might see. The sinking feeling in my stomach turned into a pit of dread as I found what I was looking for. The figures. They weren't just closer. They were almost right underneath me, nearly at the very base of my tower. A shiver crawled up my spine, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. The terrifying gravity of the situation hit me hard as I slowly, deliberately, placed the binoculars back on the table. This was no longer a distant curiosity, no longer a vague threat. I started to feel cornered, my options dwindling, my mind racing as the figures drew nearer. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted, the risk was now immediate, terrifyingly real. I rushed to take stock of what I had to defend myself. A flashlight with dimming batteries, a basic fire extinguisher, and a flare gun with a single, precious flare. No real weapons. Nothing that would be considered reliable for self-defense against whatever they were. My eyes darted to the furniture. The heavy wooden chair, the sturdy observation table, the freestanding shelves. In a burst of anxious energy, I moved them in front of the entrance, barricading myself as best as I could. It was a feeble barrier, I knew, but it was all I had. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, waiting, listening, straining for any sound that might indicate what came next. All I heard was the wind rustling through the trees and my own breath, quick and shallow time stretched out, each second feeling like an eternity as I contemplated what the figures might do, and how I could possibly respond with my limited resources. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into what felt like an hour. The tower creaked, the leaves rustled, and each sound drove my pulse higher. I felt like a cornered animal, eyes darting to the barricaded door over and over again, half expecting it to be flung open, revealing whatever awaited me outside. But that moment didn't come. I could hear my own shallow breaths filling the small room with the sound of my growing anxiety gathering every shred of courage. I reached for the binoculars again, my hands trembling as I lifted them to my eyes. I looked down to the base of the tower, half hoping, half dreading what I'd see. The figures were still there, as stationary as before. They hadn't advanced, but they hadn't retreated either. They seemed to be waiting. It was as if they were waiting for a specific moment or a sign. The standoff continued, neither side making a move, and I was left to grapple with the unnerving uncertainty of it all. The tension was unbearable. My mind raced through different scenarios. What did they want? Why were they here? Why hadn't they moved? These questions circled in my head, a dizzying maelstrom, but there were no answers. As the first faint rays of dawn began to cut through the oppressive darkness, I watched through my binoculars as the figures slowly began to retreat. They moved back into the forest, blending in with the trees until they were swallowed up by the rising morning mist. Even though the sunlight should have signified safety and warmth, I felt none of it. The profound chill inside me persisted, a cold residue of the night's terror. I sat back in my chair, trying to collect my thoughts but finding it difficult. My mind was a whirlpool of questions that looped back on themselves, offering no escape or answers. The day dragged on, each hour stretching out as I went through the motions of my duties. I maintained the tower, swept the floors, and ate canned food, but it all felt robotic, almost meaningless in the face of the uncertainty that awaited me. Several times, I picked up the radio and tinkered with it in a futile attempt to get it working again, but it remained stubbornly silent. The absence of human contact, even just a voice over the airwaves, felt like a gaping hole in my reality, amplifying my sense of profound isolation. As the afternoon waned, I found myself glancing more frequently at the descending sun. The bright sky gradually darkened into hues of orange and purple, casting long, skeletal shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The beauty of the sunset was lost on me today. Instead, its fading light only served as a stark reminder that another night was approaching. Another night with the figures. Another night of not knowing what would happen when the world outside my tower plunged into darkness. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as the sun finally surrendered, allowing the world to the impending night. The night sky was darker than usual, like a blanket of pure darkness had been thrown over the entire forest. There was no moon tonight, and the stars were hidden, making everything look like a vast, empty void. My eyes had adjusted just enough to see the figures at the base of the tower. They circled, silently, just out of the range of clear vision, close enough to make out their unsettling, shifting forms, but far enough to keep me guessing, to keep me perpetually on edge. My hand instinctively rested on the flare gun, lying beside me on the table. Thoughts rushed through my mind, each one grappling with a chilling dilemma. Should I fire the flare gun? Would it drive them away? Or would it provoke something I was utterly unprepared to handle? Suddenly, my ears picked up a noise that stood out from the background sounds of the forest, a sound that cut through the silence like a sharp knife. It was coming from directly below, at the very base of the tower. This wasn't just the wind or some animal passing through. It was a consistent, deliberate scratching noise, rhythmic and insistent. My heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Whatever was making that sound wasn't just wandering around. It was trying to ascend the tower, reacting more out of instinct than reasoned thought. I stood up abruptly, the flare gun clenched in my trembling hand. I took a deep, shuddering breath to steady myself, aimed the gun skyward and pulled the trigger. The flare soared high, a brilliant, scorching meteor cutting through the darkness. For a brief, terrifying moment, the entire forest was illuminated in an eerie, pulsating red glow, like a scene from some apocalyptic nightmare. As the flare ascended, the scratching sound stopped. The figures recoiled, dissolving back into the absolute darkness beyond the trees. For a split second, the world was silent, save for the faint hiss of the flare as it reached the peak of its ascent. It was a momentary victory, a fragile reprieve, but even as the flare began its slow descent, illuminating a smaller and smaller portion of the forest, the crushing weight of my decision began to sink in. Had I just warded off danger, or had I merely escalated a situation I didn't fully understand, a situation that felt dangerously close to the brink? I was left with an uneasy feeling, standing in the diminishing red glow of the descending flare, pondering the chilling implications of my choice. Then I noticed it. The flare's fiery tail, still burning, hit a cluster of dry leaves on the ground, directly beneath the tower. My heart sank, a cold, leaden weight, as I saw a small fire begin to spread, a tiny ember blossoming into a flickering flame. I snapped into action, my mind overriding the lingering fear. Grabbing the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, I rushed down the stairs, adrenaline pumping like a furious river through my veins. My hands worked almost on autopilot to remove the barricades I had set up at the entrance, ignoring the frantic voice in my head warning me of the dangers outside. I threw open the heavy door and raced down the spiral stairs that wrapped around the tower. My feet pounded the ground as I sprinted towards the small fire. The fire extinguisher felt heavy but manageable as I pulled the pin and aimed its nozzle at the base of the burgeoning flames. With a desperate squeeze of the trigger, the extinguisher discharged, covering the fire in a thick cloud of foam. The flames sputtered, crackled, and then mercifully died, replaced by a cloud of acrid smoke that slowly began to disperse into the night air. As the smoke cleared, the terrifying gravity of what I'd just done settled in. I had extinguished the fire, yes, but I had also stepped out of the safety of my tower. My eyes darted around the forest, frantically scanning the oppressive darkness for any sign of the shadowy figures. Nothing. They were gone as if swallowed up by the night itself. While this should have been a profound relief, it wasn't. It intensified the knot of dread in my stomach. Where did they go? Why didn't they seize the opportunity to approach me when I was most vulnerable, out in the open? Their absence, rather than reassuring me, raised more unsettling questions. Clutching the now empty fire extinguisher, I hurried back to the tower, every sound, every snapping twig or rustling leaf making me jump. My nerves were raw, frayed. I locked the door behind me, quickly restoring the barricade with shaky hands. The flare gun lay where I had left it, and I gripped it tightly, finding a small, futile sense of comfort in its cold metal. Looking out through the window, the figures were still nowhere to be seen, but that didn't alleviate the weight of unease that had settled over me. They were out there. I knew they were. I sat there, flare gun still clutched, pondering these troubling thoughts, waiting for the dawn. After what felt like an eternity, the sun finally began to rise, casting its golden light over the tops of the trees and filling the sky with gentle shades of orange and pink. Just as the dawn broke, piercing the deepest shadows, the radio crackled back to life. A voice burst through the static, clear as day. "Lookout 7, this is base. Do you copy? I copy, I responded, my voice hoarse, my fingers touching the radio microphone as if it were a fragile artifact. You won't believe what happened here last night. I saw those figures again, but they were closer, right at the base of the tower. And the radio went dead. Slow down, Elias. Start from the beginning. Elias, the supervisor, commanded. His tone sharp but concerned, I recounted everything. The figures, the relentless scratching at the tower's base, the desperate firing of the flare gun, the resulting fire, and how I had to put it out myself. The fire extinguisher is empty, I finished, my voice cracking, and there's a burned area right near the tower's base. You'll see it. There was a moment of silence from the base, a heavy pause. We're sending a rescue team, Elias. Sit tight, Elias confirmed, his voice now devoid of any skepticism, replaced by a chilling urgency. Within a couple of hours, I heard the distant rumble of an engine growing steadily louder. A profound sense of relief, so overwhelming it almost buckled my knees, washed over me as a beat-up pickup truck finally pulled up near the tower. The rescue team poured out, 4 stern-faced rangers, their eyes quickly scanning the tower and the area around it. When they got to me, I saw their faces change. I must have looked like a wild man, visibly shaken, my eyes wide and bloodshot. "Are you okay, son?" One of them, a burly ranger named Marcus, asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Even better," I replied, forcing a weak, weary smile. They found the markings at the base of the tower, exactly where I had heard the scratching. Deep, gouged marks, like claw scores, etched into the ancient wood, confirming that something had indeed tried to climb up. They also found the charred remnants of the flare and the extinguished area of the fire. Despite all of this, a subtle skepticism began to cloud their faces as they looked over the evidence. Could be raccoons, maybe a bear trying to get at your rations. Another team member suggested, examining the claw marks, his brow furrowed in a dismissive frown. "You think a raccoon fired a flare gun and started a fire?" I snapped, frustration boiling over, the lack of belief infuriating me. "It's more likely that you're suffering from isolation and stress." "Son," Marcus offered, not unkindly, "these jobs can get to you, especially when you're out here alone. Your mind can play tricks." "But I know what I saw," I insisted, my voice rising in a desperate plea. "These weren't animals. They were human-shaped, tall figures just standing there, and they were getting closer each night. And they shimmered like static." "Look, Elias," the team leader offered, his tone softening, "we all get a little stir-crazy out here. It's normal. You said yourself the radio was out. You were cut off, isolated. Maybe your mind was playing tricks on you, trying to fill the silence." I shook my head in disbelief. It was clear they weren't taking my claims seriously, dismissing my terrifying experience as the product of isolation and perhaps even paranoia. They attributed the claw marks to animals, the fire to a stray spark from the flare, and the figures to a stressed, sleep-deprived mind. As I climbed into the rescue vehicle, my feelings were complicated. On one hand, relief flooded over me, a powerful tide. I was finally getting out of this isolated place, away from the silent, watchful menace. On the other hand, a burning frustration boiled within me like a kettle on a stove. Despite the physical markings, the charred remnants, and my earnest recounting of the events, they didn't believe me. They attributed my experience to psychological stress, to a mind unraveling under the weight of solitude, and that profound lack of validation infuriated me. The engine rumbled to life, and we started to pull away. I glanced back at the tower, its wooden frame growing smaller in the distance, becoming a fragile sentinel against the endless forest. As the vehicle navigated through the uneven forest road, I couldn't help but think about what was left behind. The tower, the markings, the unknown figures. These weren't just figments of my imagination, they were real. My mind kept replaying the events, and I couldn't escape the nagging thought that maybe the forest was harboring something that defied logic and understanding, something ancient and unnerving that had chosen me for its unwitting audience. That chilling feeling, that unsettling suspicion, stuck with me as we continued to drive away. Decades passed. The memory of those unexplained figures still haunted me, a persistent, icy whisper at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to move on, to bury the experience, but it was like a splinter deep in my soul, constantly aching. After much internal debate, after countless sleepless nights replaying those terrifying days, I finally decided it was time to revisit the tower, to confront the ghosts of my past. As I drove toward the Whispering Peaks National Forest, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I parked my car at the edge of the tree line, in the same spot where the rescue vehicle had waited for me all those years ago, and took a deep, bracing breath, steeling myself before I started the familiar hike to Lookout Tower 7. Reaching the base of the tower, it appeared almost exactly as I remembered it, except for the tenacious, overgrown vines that now crawled like skeletal fingers up its weather-beaten sides. No one had used this tower in years. The fire lookout program had been modernized, the remote posts abandoned decades ago. I placed my hand on the wooden railing, the rough wood familiar beneath my palm, and started ascending the stairs. The steps groaned under my weight, a familiar sound that transported me back in time. I could feel the years of disuse in the worn wood, the air thick with dust and lingering, forgotten memories. As I climbed higher, I remembered the countless times I had made this same journey, always with a sense of duty, but never, until now, with the profound apprehension that now gripped my heart. Reaching the landing just before the very top, I paused for a moment. This was it, the last few steps that led to the observation room, the place where my world had fractured. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I climbed the remaining stairs and found myself standing in front of the closed door. The paint was peeling, long faded, and the metal handle was tarnished with age and rust, but it was just as I remembered it. My hand hesitated over the doorknob, my fingers tracing the cold, rough metal. Finally, mastering the courage I needed, I grasped the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, a long, drawn-out groan revealing the room beyond. As I stepped inside, it was like walking into a time capsule, perfectly preserved yet utterly abandoned. The same sturdy wooden table, scarred by years of use. The same simple chairs pushed haphazardly aside. Even the same old radio set that had once connected me to the outside world, now just a dusty, silent relic. A thick layer of gray dust covered everything, giving the room an air of profound, timeless abandonment. But despite this, it felt like coming back to an old chapter of my life, one that I had closed but never truly forgotten. I walked over to the window, picking up a forgotten pair of binoculars left behind, and looked out, bracing myself for what I might see. But for now, the forest below was calm, almost serene, a vast expanse of green that offered no answers, only a reflection of the mysteries I had lived through. My gaze scanned over the area where I had most often seen those elusive figures, the clearings, the footpaths, the shadowed edges of the tree line. Nothing unusual caught my eye. Just the typical, undisturbed sea of green I was about to turn away, a sigh of resignation escaping my lips, when in the corner of my eye I caught a flicker of movement. Dark shapes, indistinct yet familiar, seemed to coalesce and then dissolve in the deeper depths of the forest, just at the extreme edge of my peripheral vision. My heart leaped into my throat, a sudden, frantic beat, and I quickly, almost violently, turned the binoculars toward where I thought I had seen them. But there was nothing there now. I scanned the area intensely, meticulously, my eyes aching from the strain, yet I found nothing out of the ordinary. Did I really see them? Or was my mind, after all these years, finally playing tricks on me, succumbing to the very isolation the rangers had warned me about? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, hanging between me and the silent, watchful forest. Either way, I decided, it was time to go. I slowly put down the binoculars, my hands still trembling, and took one last, long look at the forest below, a landscape that held both terrifying memories and an undeniable, ancient beauty. Real or not, the figures remained a mystery, a chapter in my life that stubbornly refused closure. With a heavy heart, weighted by a renewed sense of unease, I left the observation room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I made my way down the tower stairs, the creaks and groans of the old wood accompanying my descent. I started my walk back to the car. The forest felt serene, yet the unease still sat heavy in my stomach, a cold, persistent stone. As I drove away, the tower grew smaller in the rearview mirror, shrinking until it was swallowed entirely by the dense, unchanging forest. Though decades had passed, the experience remained etched in my memory, a wound that never truly healed. No one ever believed my story, dismissing it as a product of isolation and an overactive imagination, a simple hallucination. But I knew what I saw and what I felt. And sometimes, late at night, in the quiet of my own home, I still catch glimpses of shifting darkness at the very edge of my vision, just beyond what I can clearly see. A chilling reminder that the forest isn't just a place. It's a presence, and that perhaps it's still watching, waiting. What was your favorite part of the story? Want more stories like this? Follow for more.